You know what? Got home today and I was reading Titus. Uh, and I had to stop at the second chapter. And there's something here that I figured was worth sharing. This is actually something that I've been thinking about recently. And is relevant in, I think, the area of reproof or exhortation. And so I'm going to read, let's see, I think there's 3 verses here. I've got it on my laptop right here. Titus 2, 6 through 8. I'm going to read this and point out a few things. And this might be able to help you out. I know it did for me, so I figured I'd just throw this out there. Likewise, chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded in all things, showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech. That's a point of emphasis in this video. Sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. And I think when it comes to this area of exhortation or reproof, I think this is where the rubber begins to meet the road, so to speak, in the Christian life and interpersonal relationships. and this is also, I think, this also shows, I think it reveals the motivations that might kind of underpin how we go about doing this. So when it comes to exhorting people, he mentions young man, but of course, we could, there's no reason to say that this doesn't apply to women also, young men, young women, to exhort or to point them to a better pattern of behavior. I think it's revealing, because when you go about doing that, I think how you view God in relationship to his people and how exactly those two relate to one another really says a lot. I think if you don't know God and you don't know his power to change people for the better, then I think you can go about doing that exhortation or reproof or pointing out something in someone's life that you disagree with or you have a problem with. If you don't know the power of God to change people, then there's no real reason to expect the other person to change. Because, there aren't too many, you might know some examples of people or people that who have undergone some sort of radical transformation in their character, either whether it's from a religious conversion or some sort of traumatic incident happens in their life, or they really, really shakes them up and then they change. But if you don't know God, then why would you ever expect people to change? As opposed to your approach, if you do know him and you do know his faithfulness to change his people, I think that makes a world of difference. And if you do know him, then I think when you approach other people for the sake of reproof or trying to point to someone and say, you might have this particular vice in your life, or there's an inconsistency with what you say you believe in and your practice. If you know God, then you know that reproof is a means that God uses for the other person to change, in fact. So what you do, as far as being sober-minded, having sound speech, when you can approach a person and you can say that, hey, brother, there's something going on here. I want to talk to you about that. I think there's some inconsistency going on here. Or there's some behaviors that's going on that's incompatible with what you say you believe in, and I want to help you out with that. And so that takes a lot of faith to do that, and to have a sense of self-control and an agreeableness, knowing how to, because when you do that to somebody, you're expressing some disapproval or saying that you disagree, but you do it in a way that you are agreeable with that person, because you're saying, hey, brother, I want to help you out. Because that's really what it comes down to. You're actually trying to help somebody, pointing out an inconsistency that they may be blind to, or they could just be, honestly, if there's some ignorance going on there, lacking knowledge, they really could be blind or oblivious to something, and they just don't know. And so that's what you would do. You would say that you would come in an agreeable spirit to try to help somebody out. If you have a knowledge of God and know that He can change people, right? So that's a big if. If you don't know Him and you don't understand how reproof goes about, at least according to Scripture, then I think what you bring to the table when you go about doing that, when your approach is predicated on this notion that people don't change or they can't change, then all you end up doing is banishing people out of your life. Where, again, and I think that makes sense. You can approach somebody and say, hey, you know what? You're doing this. You said this. I don't like that. And get out of my life. And I really do think it comes down with those two situations. I think that's what we're dealing with. This is usually, and I think in the latter, there's a complete lack of reciprocity in that kind of exchange, where there's a hostility or there's an entrenchment that goes on, where now you have two sides that are seeking to justify themselves, maybe, or trying to defend that sort of banishment of the other person, or trying to defend the reasons that they're going to, kind of excommunicate you on an individual level from one person to another. I think that, and I think this is really how. And it takes a humility, but I have another point. But it takes a humility to accept that. It takes a humility to accept, so long as, it takes humility to accept that correction. It takes humility to point out inconsistencies. Where, you really just have to say, hey, you're right, and so now I want to change, right? And then the other person, because they're actually bringing this thing to you, they're bringing this to the table, why would they not bring it to the table and then not be willing to help you through that or out of that behavior or whatever it might be. And so this is a mass difference. And so that's the gulf fixed between the two sides. Ultimately, this is how, this is how divorces come about. This is how, and so of course, shrinking the stakes significantly from, this is how divorces happen. This is how dating relationships end. This is how friends like butt heads and then you're not friends with that person anymore. This is typically, I think a lot of that flows out of what I'm talking about. How there's usually a significant disagreement or some kind of issue that arises, and then based on how that is carried out or the disposition of the individuals involved, that's what it depends on. That's what it depends on. As far as where you go from there when those conflicts arise. Because if you're not in a right relationship with God, then there's no reason to think that the other person can change, really. Because then we're looking at supernatural intervention on an incremental sense, not a sudden, get knocked off your horse kind of incident, but we're talking about an incremental change in people's character. And I think that's where the difference comes. Usually something happens and the other person, basically it expresses a refusal to work with the other person. Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And so the last line here in verse 8 is that when it talks about sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. And I think this makes. And I think this is a big thing right here, because I think if you are sound in speech and have an agreeable spirit with other people, even if they don't agree with you on this sort of exhortation or reproof, or they just don't, or this could be a massive difference in kind of like belief systems. If you are sound in speech, and you're agreeable, then there's no reason for another person to grow embittered towards you. Because I think that reveals, and so that's why there's a connection there. Sound speech that can be condemned, and the opponent being ashamed. Because that reveals someone's character. If you do have sound speech, and of course this is coupled with a very strong belief in faith here, we're looking at the text. It's coupled with that, but so long as you have that kind of spirit, then the opponent can only be ashamed. And I think that's, in a sense, that's kind of a judgment on the other person. Because if you can grow embittered or sour towards a person who is agreeable, who does show, verse 7, a pattern of good works, integrity, reverence, incorruptibility. If you grow sour towards a person like that, towards a person who has sound speech and is in fact agreeable, then I think that says a lot more about the other person, right? That they would be put to shame. That one who is an opponent may be ashamed. And that's a rare quality to find in a person, to have a strong or bold faith, and yet at the same time they're agreeable or they're peaceable. That's a very hard thing to find. Had someone talking about that recently. It's very hard to find people because usually because sometimes people can be militant, and they'll kind of, you know what I'm saying, they'll kind of push you away if you don't, if you don't agree with me, then get out of my life, or I'm never speaking to you again. But that's what happens if you don't have those virtues. If you're not agreeable, and if you don't know God, then really that's all you can do. Then you don't know how to come to a peaceable agreement with another person. Then that's all you can do, really, is just have the sort of connection with another person, whether it be any kind of relationship, whether it's a marriage, a dating relationship, a friendship, a co-worker, acquaintance, anything. Then if you have a spirit that is not agreeable, one is not showing integrity, reverence, then that's all you could ever really expect from a person who doesn't show those things. For those different connections, like all those different levels or kinds of relationships, then you can only expect them to combust suddenly, because there's really no attempt there to see another person through. Like, let's say there's a moral failure. Let's say your friend has a great, significant moral failure, and you bring it to that person, and they can just disagree and say, "Hey, really, I don't care," right? But that's the moral element, right? Because then you have to make a decision based upon whether or not people are willing to change. And I don't think that's something that really goes on too much, because there's not much discussion, I don't think, when those kind of interconnections combust. Really, it's just, you did something I don't like, you said something I don't like, and that's it. Delete my number. As opposed to, if you really did care about somebody, then you would at least put some effort forward to try to help them out. Yeah, I feel like I don't know if that was just rambling, but that's just something to think about. I was reading this text recently, and then I read it again. I was thinking about it last night also. But that it says a lot about people who are determined to hold a bad opinion of someone. Then, especially, so that's the opponent, right? If a person is determined to oppose, or determined to be passive aggressive, or have negative opinions of someone who is in fact showing integrity, a pattern of good works, reverence, sound speech, then that says a lot about that person, right? Because what are they going to do? Really, what are they going to do? Are they actually going to approach that person and talk to them? Because if that other person does have sound speech and is agreeable, then they might actually have to drop that opinion, especially if they've never spoken to them before. That's the kind of, word of mouth, grapevine opinions of other people. How you can become convinced of another person about their character, but you've never spoken to them before. Kind of funny how that happens, but it does happen. And even if you have significant differences in opinion or goals in life or values or belief systems or whatever, you couldn't remain hostile or disagreeable with a person who is sound in speech, who is agreeable. Otherwise, you're kind of revealing yourself to be a certain kind of way, to put it lightly. So that's just something I was thinking about. I certainly didn't think that would be 20 minutes, but probably because I was rambling. But that's something to think about. That's something to think about when it comes to reproof or exhortation or coming to someone when you have a problem with them, something that they said or did, coming with an agreeable spirit and say, hey, let me help you out with that. Because what you did or said or whatever, I don't like. I don't agree with that. So let me try to help you out with that. That's hard to find. You don't see that too much. So, yeah, that's about it, man. I'm gonna upload this to YouTube, and I'm gonna post it on Facebook too. But it's really long, so wouldn't expect too many people to watch it or even make it this far. But just some thoughts.